So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet, and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king asked again, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Who is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage and left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life.
Well, good morning, and who day? See, I bet Doug and certainly Nick, as a Kansas City Chief fan, wouldn't greet you that way, but I will. Who day? It's great to be here today and for us to be able to wrap up this series on Esther. If this is your first Sunday with us in 2023, I'm really glad you're with us. You have missed a lot over the last couple of weeks, and so something that we encourage everyone to do anytime you miss a week or more is to make sure you go to our website to watch those. But in those first 2 weeks, we kind of began this series called Bare Bones, Esther. And we call it that because from time to time, we will take a book that typically is a little more obscure and try to cover it from a 30,000-foot view or so. Meaning, we don't take it and dissect it verse by verse, but we try to kind of cover the highlights and talk about different things, but also to bring familiarity perhaps to books that sometimes are avoided or just we don't talk about a whole lot. And so Esther is one of those books. It's not a book that you hear us quote all the time or oftentimes come back to. It's a book that maybe for some of you, you've even just like, yeah, this is the first time I've ever even heard about it. But our hope is that over the last 2 weeks, and certainly today, that it brings new life to a book, but also causes you, because we're not covering every single detail, to go back and to study it more yourself and to try to catch some of the other smaller details in it that we just honestly don't have a lot of time to cover. But if you have been with us, you know that we've covered a lot, that we've already been through 5 chapters, and today, admittedly, we have a lot to fly over, chapters 6 through 10 today, but just in an effort to catch everybody up and to remind all of us of where we've been. The book of Esther begins by introducing us to a powerful king named Xerxes. And he's reigning over most of the known world at that time. And he really was powerful. He had a lot of territory that he was in charge of, and he knew it. And one of the ways that he showed people he knew it was he would throw parties. He would throw these lavish banquets. And so as Esther opens in chapter 1, you see that he throws a 6-month-long party, 180-day long party. And it goes on and on. As you can imagine, if you're throwing a 6-month-long party and there is drinking and revelry going on, all chaos is probably ensuing as well. And one of the things that's interesting that's noted about how extravagant and lavish and just wild this party was early on, it just says that people drank as much as they wanted. Everyone did as they pleased. And so in the midst of this party, King Xerxes decides, I want to show Queen Vashti off. I want to show everyone my queen. And so he sends for Queen Vashti, bring her in front of us. I want her to parade in front of everyone so people can see not only how powerful and amazing I am, but who I have as queen. Well, Vashti refuses. Maybe she got tired of a 6-month-long party long before he did and thought, no way, no way. Sober up. I don't know. Who knows what she was thinking, but she refused. And she said, no, I'm not coming. And so word gets back to King Xerxes. Your queen doesn't want to come into your presence. And so this upsets him, and he gets some of his officials together and says, she's refusing to come. What should we do? And so they come up with the idea of, well, she's not queen anymore. And so they get rid of Queen Vashti, and she's no longer queen. But Xerxes still needs a queen. And so he decides, I'm going to have a beauty pageant. And so he calls for every eligible girl far and wide to come and to go through a year-long process of beauty treatments and to learn what it looks like potentially to be the queen. And he's trying to figure out who strikes my eye and who do I like and who do I hit it off with. And so in the midst of this beauty pageant, Esther, a Jew, becomes queen. He likes her and he picks her, but he doesn't know she's a Jew. And the reason he doesn't know she's a Jew is because Esther doesn't reveal that, because she has a cousin named Mordecai who has kind of been a father figure in her life and helped raise her and bring her along. And he's a Jew as well. And he has said to her, do not reveal your heritage, your nationality. We are foreigners. We're exiles here. We wouldn't be safe. And she becomes the queen. And so as she's now the queen, Mordecai continues to keep an eye on her. And he wants to care for her and make sure that even as the queen, she still is safe. And so Mordecai spends his days hanging around kind of the palace gates and getting as close as he can, but just kind of not revealing who he is or anything. And so nobody knows that they even know each other. He's just hanging out. And as he's doing that, we see that the king has kind of become perhaps a little more paranoid or a little more kind of closed off to a lot of people. And the reason he does that is because one day Mordecai discovers that there's an assassination plot against King Xerxes. And he gets word to Esther somehow, tell the king some of his officials are trying to kill him. So Esther tells the king, there's an assassination plot. Somebody's trying to kill you, and it's discovered to be true, and they get rid of those guys, and that gets recorded in the king's annals, the record book. And so that's what made him paranoid. Is from that assassination attempt, you see moving forward that he doesn't have all of these officials and nobles. Instead, he makes one person his right-hand man. And that man is named Haman. Travis talked about him last week. His name's Haman, and he is the villain in the story. And so Haman rises to this position of authority and power, and he falls in love with his power and authority. And as he comes and goes into the palace or wherever he finds himself, people know who he is, so they bow down to him and they give him reverence and honor and respect, all except for Mordecai. And so Mordecai will not bow to this Haman guy, and the other people that notice this about Mordecai figure out he won't bow, he won't honor Haman because Mordecai is a Jew. And as a Jew, he bows to no human man. And so Haman discovers this. And this really upsets Haman because does he know who I am? And he discovers that Mordecai is a Jew. So he gets an audience with King Xerxes and says, King Xerxes, there is a group of people that despise you. There is a group of people that is a threat to the throne. There's a group of people that is a threat to your crown, and they are just a threat to your entire kingdom. And the king says, well, Haman, what should I do? And Haman says, how about we annihilate them? And you see in the story, he actually takes this dice and he rolls it, and what it lands on determines the month and the day that this group of people would be annihilated. And the king agrees to this. And so Haman is given a ring, a signet ring from the king. And the decree is made, and it's stamped and signed, and Haman wears that ring, and now this edict has gone out that the Jews will be killed on a certain month, on a certain day. And Mordecai hears this decree and goes, oh no, what are we to do? And so he tells Esther about what wicked Haman has done and this edict that has gone out, and he convinces Esther, listen, you have to do something. You have to stand up for us. This is not only a threat against all of the Jews far and wide. This is a threat against me, your cousin Mordecai, but not just me, you, Esther, for you yourself are a Jew. And you get to chapter 4, and it's where we get probably the most popular verse from the book of Esther. And Travis talked about this last week. It comes from chapter 4. This is what Mordecai says to Esther. He says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. And so Esther realizes he's right. And so she commits to go before the king. And that's a big deal because Esther knows that even as the queen, you're not allowed to just go up to the king and talk to him. You have to be summoned. That even as the queen, she would have to be summoned by the king. And so what does she decide to do? She gets dressed up and she puts on the best clothes she can wear, probably, of just, she wants to get his attention, and she dresses up royally as the queen, and she goes and she hangs out in the hall outside of where Xerxes is sitting on his throne. And he sees his queen, Esther, and he notices her. And maybe he can tell something's going on. We don't know, but he calls her in and says, Esther, what is your request? I'll give you up to half of my kingdom if you want it. What is your request, Esther? And we learned this last week. Esther had been preparing for this moment. That she had been led to not only pray, but to fast and discern, God, what am I supposed to say? And so she was ready. And so she looked at the king, and Haman is there with him because he's the king's right-hand man. And she says, I would like to invite you two to a banquet. Come to a banquet that I have prepared. And so the king says, okay, and Haman is excited. I'm a VIP. I will come. And so they show up at this banquet. And he says, Esther, what is your request? And again, God had been preparing her for this moment. And she says, and it sounds a little comical, it sounds a little redundant. She looks at the king and she looks at Haman and she says, here's my request. Come to a banquet I'm going to throw tomorrow. I would like to have you both, just you two, to a banquet tomorrow. If you come tomorrow, then, king, I will tell you what my request is. And so they leave for the night. And Haman couldn't be more full of himself. He is so excited. I am King Xerxes' right-hand man, and now I've had an audience not just with him, but the queen, and she's invited me to one banquet, and she's throwing another banquet for us tomorrow. This is incredible. And so the passage says that he goes home, and on his way, he bumps into Mordecai again. And there's Mordecai who doesn't honor Haman. And he won't bow down, and this just again upsets Haman so much that he decides, I've got to do something right away. I don't even want to wait until that month and that day. And so he says to his wife, listen to what this Mordecai guy, he doesn't respect me. And she's probably like, yeah, honey, I know, right? And his advisors are like, yeah. And so what should we do? And they come up with a plan. They say, let's make a 75-foot-long pole with a stake on it. And tomorrow, tell the king, let's kill Mordecai. Let's put Mordecai on that stake. Gross, right? No? Okay, yes. And so Haman's thinking, that's a good plan. Meanwhile, and that's where we leave off. That's where we left off. A story hanging in the balance. An entire people group who now just have months to live. And now, it seems like Mordecai has just hours to live. Look at what happens next. That night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he had set up for him. His attendants answered, Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in, the king ordered. And when Haman entered, the king asked him, what should be done for the man the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honor than me? And so in between parties, while Haman's off plotting to kill Mordecai, the king can't sleep. And as the king, he can do whatever he wants to pass the time, right? I mean, he could have asked for whomever he wanted to be brought in to entertain him, to talk to him, maybe someone very boring until he fell asleep. He could have invited whoever he wanted to pass the time until he could fall asleep. He could have asked for his favorite food, his favorite bedtime snack. He could have done whatever he wanted with that. He could have said, I can't sleep. I'm going to get up, bring my security detail. I'm just going to go for a walk. He could have gone wherever he wanted until he felt a little more tired. But that's not what happened, is it? Instead, he asks for the records of his reign and rule. Bring some of those records in and read them to me. I want to be reminded of how great I am, of my kingdom. And so an attendant goes, and the attendant, he could have grabbed any one of the books of the records of the king, but he didn't. He grabbed one specific book. And the attendant, when he came back and started reading to the king, he could have just picked a page and just started reading, but he didn't end up just picking a random page, did he? He opened to a specific story, and he began to read it. The exact story that reminded the king of how a man named Mordecai had discovered an assassination plot against him, and Xerxes had been saved. This is the turning point in the story. And what happens next teaches us something that I hope we've already discovered in this series, and I certainly hope it's something that we just begin to discover every day as we continue to try to follow Jesus, and it's this: God is always in control, and he is always at work. Regardless of how silent or absent God may seem in a story, and it seems like so far he has been in this one, he is not. He is fully present, and his hands are on everything. Despite how things may seem, God has not abandoned his promise of deliverance. You see, it was customary for a Persian king to promptly reward any subject that had done something honorable for the king. And so Xerxes discovers, oh my goodness, we never carried out an honor on Mordecai. We never reimbursed him, so to speak, for the way that he saved me and saved the kingdom. We need to make this right. And so he wakes up committed to make it right. He, as soon as possible, is going to give Mordecai the honor that he deserves. And Haman, he wakes up in a different mindset, right? He wakes up determined, as soon as I'm with the king, I cannot wait to tell him about wicked Mordecai, and he is going to die today. So these two men collide, and they intersect. Haman, full of himself, thinking that the king must be talking to him. When the king asks him, how should we reward this man? Haman says this. He comes up with what he thinks is going to be his prize. For the man that the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Wow. Like I said, this is the turning point in the story. Haman has no choice but to carry out the king's command. But can you imagine how Haman must feel? Like, put on this robe. Here, get on the horse. Hail, hail, this is the guy the king wants, right? No, he had to make a display of it. He had to sell it. Inside, he has so much disdain and hatred, but he has to honor this man. And so as soon as the parade ends, it says Mordecai just went back to where he typically hung out, and Haman went home covered in grief. In other words, he went back devastated, realizing it's over. There's no hope for me. I am as good as dead. I am ruined. But he doesn't even have time to figure out a new plan. Why? Well, because it's time to go to the banquet. And so he gets rushed into this VIP banquet. It's him, it's King Xerxes, and it's Esther. And this is what happens. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. And as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing. And Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage. He left his wine and he went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life now. The first 6 chapters of this have been building to this moment. Finally, Esther can tell the king what she wants to tell him. Finally, Haman's wicked plot can be revealed. Not only has Haman conspired to kill the Jews, he's conspired to kill Mordecai, whom the king has just honored. And not just the Jews, and not just Mordecai, Haman has conspired to kill Queen Esther. She too is a Jew. And so this obviously disturbs King Xerxes. And it leaves Haman pleading for his life, but pleading will do him no good. And so the king comes back in, and what should we do with Haman? And one of the attendants says, well, overnight, I saw Haman and some guys, they were like building this thing. I think maybe we should kill him on that. And the king's like, I like it. And so, this is gross, they hang Haman on his own death device that he thought Mordecai would die on. Boom. The end of Haman. End of the story, right? I mean, Esther is saved. Mordecai is saved. The Jews are saved. It's actually not the end of the story. I mean, Esther is still the queen. And Mordecai actually gets promoted to the position that Haman was in. But there's still the edict. There's still this decree that Haman had tricked Xerxes into writing. Because it was binding. It was irrevocable. You see, when Xerxes gave that ring to Haman and said, make it so, it couldn't be revoked. And so what were they to do? Esther asks for another decree to be written. Esther 8, 5-6, she says this. She says, if it pleases the king, and if he regards me with favor and thinks it's the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order to be written, overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all of the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? You see, Esther was smart. She asked the king to issue an order that would combat the one that's already been enacted. If the first one can't be reversed, perhaps it could be neutralized. So the king agrees, to the point that he tells her and Mordecai they can write whatever they want in his name. And he gives Mordecai that same ring that they got off of Haman before they hung him. And so Mordecai now has this powerful ring, and they seal it in the name of the king. Let it be so. So chapter 8, it says the king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and to protect themselves, to destroy and kill and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all of the provinces of King Xerxes, it was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. So the decree that they wrote up meant that every Jew who had received a death sentence when that first decree Haman had cooked up could now defend themselves. That whoever came to carry it out, whoever was still loyal to Haman, they could defend themselves. These were exiles who had been sold into slavery. These were exiles who had no real home. These are exiles who had been displaced, exiles who wanted their holy city, Jerusalem, restored and longed for that. They wanted to see that the Savior that they had been promised, and they were clinging to that one day he would come. These were the people that were now told, you may defend yourselves. And so you had this day that was circled on the calendar, and it was the same day. The same month and the same day that originally Haman, when he rolled the dice, was now they wrote another decree. And so these people loyal to Haman, the enemies of the Jews, had circled that day, we are coming for you. And the Jews thought, we're circling it too, and we're going to be ready. And so it says this, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. And on this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And so the story culminates in these epic days of battle where it seemed like all hope could be lost, but instead evil was defeated. The Jews defended themselves in every city and province and everywhere they were, and they not just defended themselves, they eliminated the threat. They left no enemy alive. And once it was all over and the dust had settled, they said to themselves, we never want to forget this. We never want to forget the day that it seemed like God was silent, but he saved us and rescued us. And so they instituted an annual day of celebration where they would never forget, a day that had been reserved for bad was now worth celebrating. It says this, Esther 9. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the province of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th day of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned to joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the day as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. A yearly festival that they would be reminded of God's deliverance. Your sorrow has now turned to joy. A day that seemed like you would be full of mourning is now a day of celebration. Feast, give presents and food to one another and to those that have none. A beautiful ending to an amazing book. Esther is safe. She's still queen. We see Mordecai in a high place of honor, and both of them continue to advocate and speak up for the people of God. So what do we do with this story? Well, if you've been with us, you know that over the last 2 weeks, Aaron and Travis both in their teaching, introduced us to a couple of questions and a couple of statements. And I know I said this at the beginning, but if you missed week 1, you really should go back and watch it, because Aaron not only did an incredible job of introducing the book of Esther, but it was an amazing teaching on what it looks like to just simply read the Bible and to understand how to read it responsibly and to frame every single thing that you read. But in week 1, he asked us this question. He said, where and how do you think God may be wanting to use you? And once you ask that question, he then said this: fix your attention on God. And then last week, as Travis took us into the book a little more and we discovered what was at stake for Esther and Mordecai and every Jew, he challenged us with this question: what is the simple thing that God is calling you to do? And as you ask that question, he said, keep your attention on God, stay focused on God. And so as we wrap up this series and we wrap up this morning, I'd like to pose a couple of other questions. The first one is this: where do you need to stay? In other words, who do you need to help and speak up for where you currently are? As we've repeatedly learned through this book, the place that we find ourselves is exactly where God wants to use us. But sometimes I think we can miss the importance of staying and how impactful that can really be. God desires for each of us, you and I, to be used by him. And a big part of that is seeing where we are and the role that we play in caring for others. Mordecai and Esther, they could have run. I mean, they really could have. I mean, it seems unlikely and it seems like, yeah, but they really could have. I mean, Mordecai could have just skipped town immediately. He could have gotten word to Esther saying, I'm out of here. You should run. You probably have the resources to make it. And I'm going to try to warn as many Jews along the way as I go. They both could have run. But they stayed. They stayed for the relief and the deliverance of an entire people, and not just in this story. Here's what I mean. Their willingness to stay kept the Jews alive in that story, but it also helped bring us life today. Let me explain. One of the things Aaron taught us in the first week was there's a book called Ezra, and there's a book called Esther, and there's a book called Nehemiah, and they all kind of coincide and run parallel with each other in terms of time and when these actually happened in history. And the book of Nehemiah is before the book of Esther in our Bible, but the story of Nehemiah and what takes place there actually happened after the book of Esther. Now, if you've heard the name Nehemiah before, you may be thinking, yeah, that's the story where in the book of Nehemiah, he had access to the king. And he was his cupbearer, and he would serve the king. And Nehemiah was a Jew. He was a Jew in exile, in bondage. And Nehemiah was heartbroken because the city of Jerusalem, where they had all come from, the holy city, was in shambles and in ruins. And this distressed Nehemiah, to the point that one day he was so distraught in the king's presence that the king noticed and said, Nehemiah, what is the matter? What is wrong? That king's name was Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was the son of Xerxes, the king in Esther. When Xerxes died, Artaxerxes became king. But do you know who the queen remained? A woman named Esther. And so when Nehemiah comes before Artaxerxes, distraught that this holy city of Jerusalem is in ruins, and says, I'm sad because my people have been in exile and bondage, and I just want to go and restore it to its former glory. And the king and the queen were compassionate. It was Queen Esther who was compassionate. She too was a Jew. And here's why that's significant, because when Nehemiah got permission to go and to restore Jerusalem, he needed help. And so he took a bunch of people with him. A bunch of people whose names are really hard to pronounce. But one of those people was a man named Zerubbabel. Exactly. Zerubbabel. Why is he important? Well, If you were to turn from the book of Esther and Nehemiah and go to the New Testament, maybe you did this a few weeks ago over Christmas. Maybe over Christmas you all read the Christmas story. But in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3, you get the genealogy of Jesus. You get the bloodline of Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 1, verse 12, tucked in the middle of the genealogy of Jesus, you get this little, what may seem like a very insignificant verse. After the exile to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel was the father of Zerubbabel. Now, we don't have enough time to go into all of this, but here's why I point this out. If Haman's plot had succeeded, he would have killed all the Jews. Meaning Haman would have killed Esther. He would have killed Mordecai. And he wouldn't have stopped there. He would have gone to every area and every province. And do you know who that included? Nehemiah. If Haman had succeeded in killing all of the Jews, there would be no Nehemiah. And if there was no Nehemiah, there would have been no Zerubbabel. And if there was no Zerubbabel, there would have been no Jesus Christ. What they did then impacted us today. Who knows what God will call each of us to next? But as long as we are where we are, may we be faithful, and may we speak up and help whoever we can with all we have. Question number 2. Who's been instrumental in helping you get to where you are? If this is where you are, who has helped you? Who's been instrumental in where you find yourself? You see, when I read the book of Esther, it's obvious that God's hand was moving. God used Esther in a mighty way to see his people saved, but he also put Mordecai exactly where he needed to be. Without Mordecai caring for Esther as a little girl and bringing her with him wherever he went, we wouldn't see her in the position she ends up in. And Mordecai stayed with her, reminding her who she was for perhaps such a time as this. This past week, I had the honor and privilege of teaching one of our men's Bible studies here at our Lakeside Park campus, but it was last minute. The teacher for that specific study had emergency dental surgery. He had to have a tooth removed, and so last minute they needed a fill-in. And so I agreed to kind of help lead the class and stumble my way through it that night. And so it was week 1 of a study that our men are doing on a book by Bob Goff called Love Does. Now, I don't know if you know who Bob Goff is, but he's an author that's been around for a while, and he's written a bunch of different books that are very inspiring and kind of just a very natural, down-to-earth kind of here's what it looks like to follow Jesus and to be brave and to live for him. But if you read any of Bob Goff's books, he also makes you kind of feel like you just aren't very good. And here's what I mean by that is he's lived an incredible life, like a lot of adventure. His life is just full of he's been around some amazing people and famous people. He's been in the room with all kinds of diplomats and world leaders and all of these things. And so you read it and the temptation is to get a little discouraged of like, oh, I'm not very good. And he doesn't share all those things to discourage people. It's more so just to say, look at the place that God has put me and how I want to continue to serve him faithfully, and you should too, fellow followers of Jesus. And so in the midst of our study on Tuesday night, he talked about what it was like for him growing up. And he talked about how he got into the later years of high school and he didn't like school at all. He hated it. And not just didn't like it, he wasn't good at it. He wasn't smart. He got really poor grades to the point that he thought to himself, I'm just going to take the GED, but then he realized it was a test. And so he's like, I don't even want to do that. And so he just thought, I'm going to drop out of school. I'm not only going to drop out of school, I'm going to pack up my Volkswagen and I'm just going to go out west and I'm just going to like climb mountains and be a vagabond and maybe just try to find odd jobs and whatever. And before he left, he thought, I want to say goodbye to someone. that he shared in the video that there was this guy named Randy that had been so significant in his life. That Randy was just a few years older than him at the time, had been his young life leader, and just Randy had changed Bob's life. Not because of any Bible story that he taught, but rather Randy was with him. That through the ups and downs of Bob's high school years, Randy was with him and just by his side and just encouraging him. And so Bob wanted to tell Randy bye. So he knocks on Randy's door and tells him, I'm leaving town. I'm going to go be a vagabond for a while. I'm done in high school or whatever. And he said Randy shut the door, went back inside, and about 5 minutes later came back out with a bag. And he looked at Bob and said, let's go. And so they got in Bob's Volkswagen and they drove and they just started climbing mountains for a few days and just kind of just, living out of the van and just, being vagabonds. But that ran out really quick because they had no money and no plan, and it just wasn't sustainable. And so it was like, okay, back to reality. And so they go back, and Bob's going to drop Randy off at his house, and they pull in, he says, and he notices that Randy's girlfriend's car is in the driveway. And he thought, I guess she's waiting on us, whatever. And so Bob said, I was a high school kid. I didn't know any better. I just invited myself in. And so Randy and I walked into his house, and I started looking around, and I saw there was like a box that had a crock pot opened up, and I looked over there, and there was like a box of sheets and some stuff, and there was a box of silverware and stuff. And he said, and then it dawned on me, these are wedding presents. And he discovered that the day before he showed up at Randy's house, Randy had gotten married. Married on a Saturday, and Bob showed up on a Sunday and told him, this is what I'm up to. And Randy looked at him and said, I'm with you. Now, I don't know if Randy's still married. But it changed Bob's life. That in his hour of need, and at a place where he found himself that was just so critical, another person said, this is where I am, and I'm with you. And I'm just going to keep cheering you on. And so in our study on Tuesday, the challenge was to stop right there, not go any further in the study, and for each person that was present to think of someone that was a Randy in their life. And right then and there, to either call them, send them a text, send them an email, or even get out a piece of paper and do a handwritten note, but not to go any further in the study until we did that. And so we did. And so there were about 12 of us in the room, and it got quiet, and we all did that. And I have no idea who the other men sent messages to, but I sent a text to a very dear friend of mine who for the last 10 years has just been by my side. In my lowest of lows, but also at times where I feel like I was doing well, and the highest of highs. And just, we've experienced so much together, and we're better for it. And he just continues to be by my side and a cheerleader and an advocate for me, and it makes me better. And I went home that night, and I thought of not just him who I had texted, but I thought of other people in my life. I thought about my mom who raised 3 kids on her own and did whatever she could and picked up however many odd jobs she could in the summers to help pay for the things that we wanted to be involved in and for us just to make it. I thought about a man named Everett Brewer who my mom met early on as a follower of Jesus, and he became the preacher at the little church I grew up at, but he became my gym teacher and my basketball coach and our bus driver, and he'd give us rides when we didn't have a car. He was about as close to a dad as I've ever had. I thought about 18 years ago when I got interviewed to be a part of this church. And the pastor at the time was a man named John Russell, who had done so much in ministry and had, just had a huge successful church here in northern Kentucky. And they wanted me to come and be a part of that staff. And how for the last 18 years, John, who's at Hebron right now, serving faithfully there, has been a cheerleader for me. And from time to time, just sending me texts or seeing each other on Sunday mornings or other times and just saying, I'm proud of you, kid. And realizing that him being with me has made all the difference and allowed me and so many others to stand on his shoulders. and to continue to care for other people. And so as we close this morning and we close this series, I want to give each and every one of you the opportunity to do the same. We're going to take the next couple of minutes, and I want to invite you to pull out your phone, which will probably be the first time you've ever heard somebody say, pull out your phone in the middle of a sermon. Listen, the Bengals don't play until tonight. There's no reason to be on your phone, all right? Until now. And to send a text. Or maybe it's to pull out your phone and write a note that you're going to send later. Or maybe it's an email, or maybe it's just even handwritten to someone. Maybe as soon as we're done, you don't leave this room, but rather you go up into the balcony in a private place or over here in one of the corners, and you dial someone's number and you call them, and they hear your voice, and you say, I just want to call and thank you for being with me and being a part of my life. But let's take a couple of minutes and do that, and then I'll come back and pray as we close. Father, I thank you for today. I thank you for another day that you have given us to be reminded of your goodness and your faithfulness, even when it seems like we can't see it. Father, I pray that as we head out from this place today, that we are reminded of your Son, what his arrival and rescue for each and every one of us means. And Father, may we continue to be people that see where we are, where we're being led, and who we're called to faithfully follow. And Father, I thank you that you promise to be with us every step of the way. It's in your name I pray. Amen.